What comes to your mind when you hear this list of phrases? Closed door conversations, setting a trap, sycophant, flattery, hidden agenda, doing someone else's dirty work, hypocrisy. Do you think about the current political scene in the US? Or do you think about an episode in the life of Jesus? Now, if Anne hadn't just read that text, my guess is that every one of us would have said politics in the US, hands down. This text is extraordinary on many levels. It's hard to do it justice. I'm always amazed at how much you can get out of a conversation that Jesus has with people in everyday life. The story from Matthew 22 is yet another example of there is nothing new under the sun. Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God, has for years been interpreted as meaning the separation of church and state. You know, civic versus spiritual allegiances, duty to church and responsibility to the state. Ironically, according to theologians Marcus Borg and Dominic Crossan, this text is not about the separation of church and state. That separation would have been unthinkable given the situation in the time in which this exchange took place. Caesar was not only a political head of state, he proclaimed himself to be a god. There was no separation whatsoever, and those who refused to hail Caesar as a god ran into some serious trouble. We have to remember that historically, there had been generations of kings and emperors who had thrown crumbs to the Jewish community in exchange for subservient obedience, including imposed monetary demands, all the while entrenching their own political empire and financial wealth and expanding their territory of reign. Herod the Great built extravagant, beautiful buildings, architectural masterpieces, parts of which still exist in present-day Jerusalem. Because Herod was responsible for tremendous tourism in and a burgeoning pilgrimage to Jerusalem, it's no wonder that the people of Israel wanted to curry favor with him. After all, they were able to enjoy what his accomplishments had meant for the region. Did this blind those religious establishments to Herod's atrocities, to the point where they were willing to make far-reaching concessions? Were they simply grateful for a place, even while accepting that they must then bow to the demands of Rome in exchange for measured religious freedoms? Absolutely. What they did not realize or want to acknowledge at that time was that when the chips were down for the regime, and that time always comes for empires, the Romans would also be willing to massacre them, if need be, to retain power and control. This happened repeatedly throughout history. Think about the massacre of the innocent children during the time when Jesus was very young, or the subsequent fall of Jerusalem after a revolt against corruption. Whatever is expedient is what ruthless rulers do. This was the ethos in which this exchange took place. So if the issue Jesus was presented with as a trap is not the separation of church and state, what is it? Jesus asked this contingent, representing religion and state, to produce a coin, something that all of them carried in their pockets. It was a coin with the image of a pagan god on it, Caesar. No problem for the state representatives. Big problem for the interns of the Pharisees, who were representing one of the most significant religious institutions of the day, supposedly espousing sole authority and allegiance to the God of Israel. Jesus' statement, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God, should have raised enormous tensions within the interns of the Pharisees. What did, in fact, belong to God that hadn't been subsumed by Caesar? Where did allegiance to one begin and the other end? What still belonged to God that the religious community hadn't been willing to offer for some advantage within the empire, even if this advantage was quite insignificant? Was there anything? So that's a little bit about the backdrop of that story. The players in this exchange are fascinating. I suppose Jesus had developed quite a reputation around the area by this time, so much so that neither the religious leaders nor the heavyweights of the empire were willing to come engage him in person. So they send the interns, the ones who work for less money, the ones who, they sometimes send out bogus tweets. The group's primary competence seems to be flattery. They're smooth talkers. They hope that by starting with what their bosses had heard were some of Jesus's best qualities, they'd be able to catch him off guard, at least long enough to be able to trap him with this question. Beware of smooth talkers. Beware of those who smile and give you disingenuous messages about your tremendous skill, your charisma, your success. Always weigh questions about the law and politics and religion very carefully. None of us is Jesus after all. Our gut responses are rarely the right ones. At least that's certainly been my case, my experiences. I regularly regret firing back with a withering answer to some question that obviously has less than stellar motives. I trust Jesus to be able to do that. Myself? Not so much. Jesus can also get by with calling people hypocrites to their face. Some seasoned and respected leaders of our day can do the same. But we may do better to speak about hypocritical decisions, attitudes, words, positions, rather than labeling people as such. Now, that's not to say there aren't hypocrites around. It's more a matter of using language that unites rather than alienates. The environment in which we live is already charged with hostility, mistrust, anger, and we will never come together if we fuel enmity. Then we hear the question they actually came with. Does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not? The Jewish law, that is. Jesus, the master communicator, asks for a commonly used object to make his case, a coin, local currency, with an image and inscription on it. His counter question, whose image do you see, is answered with Caesar's. His reply, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar and to God what belongs to God, seems benign at face value. Okay, that's reasonable. Keep both God and the state happy. On the other hand, maybe they, because they lived in that environment, could see and hear and feel and perceive what you and I don't. Did they realize at that point that Jesus was essentially asking, whom do you serve? We might recoil at this, arguing that simply carrying a country's currency cannot be used as a measure of one's allegiance to God or country. It's simply currency. It's necessary for financial transactions and business. What about this currency? I'm waiting for a photo to appear. It's actually a picture of a $20 bill. There it is. What do you see? Well, clearly it's a $20 bill. Whose image is on it? Well, that'd be Andrew Jackson. And who was he? Jackson, the 7th president of the United States, receives mixed reviews. He eliminated the national debt. He worked to eliminate waste and corruption. Also, during his presidency, he granted favors to supporters, friends, and family members. As a result, we have cronyism and nepotism firmly embedded in politics today. Jackson became a wealthy slave-holding plantation owner, owning as many as 300 slaves in his lifetime, including while he held the office of the president. His Indian removal policy of 1830 resulted in what has become known as the Trail of Tears. The forceful removal of indigenous people from east of the Mississippi all the way to Oklahoma, and enforced march on foot that claimed the lives of over 3,000 indigenous people. Jesus asked, whose image and inscription is this? Caesar. Jackson. Where's the connection? And why does it matter? The ethos of Jesus' day was saturated with emperor worship, Caesar worship. The worshiping Jewish community included. The scope of this sermon doesn't allow me to elaborate on this, but history bears this out. They lived with it, benefited from it, were tormented and mistreated by it, and ultimately faced brutality and death because of it. Father Richard Rohr speaks of empire as all the individual parts that make up what Paul the Apostle writes about as powers, principalities, and thrones. You'll find this language in a letter to the Colossians, the 1st chapter. But before I lose you with all these mystical terms, think of, and I quote Rohr again, think of corporations, institutions, nation states, and organizations that demand our full allegiance and thus become, in many ways, idolatrous. Not just too big to fail, but even too big to be criticized. Suddenly, that medieval notion of devils comes very close to home. And Rohr continues, when the systems of the world, which is a term that writers of scripture use, when the systems of the world are able to operate as denied and disguised evil, they do immense damage because they are invisible and unaccountable. When those same corporate evils have risen to sanctified, romanticized, and idealized necessities that are saluted, glorified, and celebrated in big paychecks, golden parachutes, parades, songs, rewards for loyalty, flags, marches, medals, and monuments, they represent those devils, end quote. People of faith are always in danger of being part of unholy alliances. The empire, which is usually an alliance of both the religious and political empires, will use smooth talkers as the face and voice, which can easily be embraced or dismissed. They themselves do not wield the power. They are simply tools to deflect from the powers and principalities so they can continue executing their schemes. Smooth talkers will never entertain discourse that questions the very fiber of those they represent. We need to be aware of these tools. We need to be alert so we can avoid believing or becoming agents of a much larger self-serving system. We must develop heightened radar, yet not becoming paranoid or reactionary, but to recognize where we are impacted by the unholy alliances that permeate empires. It seems we won't see the image of Andrew Jackson replaced with a picture of Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill anytime soon. It's no secret that the empire is at this point unwilling to remove an icon of white supremacy to make room for the abolitionists whose life devoted to the freeing of enslaved people is legendary. And this is the empire whose currency you and I carry. By the way, if you've not seen the movie Harriet, I highly recommend it. We are living in empire. If you've been shocked by how angry you become when freedoms are snatched away, when people are insulted, when laws are violated with impunity, when people die because of mismanagement of a pandemic, when people are targeted simply because of who they are or the color of their skin or their country of origin, this is your internal justice meter going off. This is because you have devoted yourself to Jesus. This means you still recognize the dissonance, and may we never become accustomed to it. Unholy alliances exist for expediency, power, and money for those brokering those coalitions. That's it. Not for the benefit of those they rule. There is no conscience involved, no compassion, no sense of decency or remorse. Yes, there are some politicians who have bought into that. Some business people have, some religious leaders have. Yet there is no person or group that is immune to the intense lure of that power. We are all endangered. Just as Jesus pointed out to the smooth talkers and all those who overheard that exchange, everyone lives as a participant that benefits them. These systems, we are violated by empire, but we are also benefactors of that empire. That's the empire of Caesar, as well as the empire of Jackson, all of us. And yet we aren't destined to defeat or despair. As is so often the case, awareness allows us to grow into more freedom. When we recognize that we do not live in an insulated, safe, predictable environment, or in a Christian nation, as some would say, we can let go of the disorientation that comes when we feel that we're alone, like we're the only ones who've ever lived this kind of experience. This awareness helps us to recognize those who deflect and disguise what's really going on. It's helpful, even if it is only helpful to a point. Jesus didn't spend a whole lot of time fighting unholy alliances, though he frequently pointed out the hypocrisy which was rampant within religious institutions. He deals with the smooth talkers of the alliance efficiently and effectively. And then he goes on to do what he is there to do. And that's material for a lot of focus and many sermons. His mission was not derailed nor diminished because of where he finds himself in history. He was laser focused on his mission, and he claimed it and he reclaimed it quickly. As we head into the final weeks of this turbulent election season, let me encourage us to be aware. We live in an empire with innumerable unholy alliances. And let me suggest there is no clear demarcation between church and state. We, after all, we live one life. The human experience, and this experience is dramatically impacted by our political landscape, as well as by whichever existential sphere we have chosen to align with and embrace. There always have been, and there always will be closed-door conversations, schemes to set traps, hypocrisy, hidden agendas. The question we pose repeatedly is, Whose image and inscription is it? Whom do we serve? What is our mission? We must claim and reclaim this mission again and again. Amen.